Hi, Dr. Kujawa. It's such a pleasure to, of course, invite you and to have you. And of course, have such gratitude for you to agree to do this interview with us.
Thank you, Clark. I'm really happy to be here and very grateful for the translation of The Other Goddess. Very happy to be here.
And your book, I personally read, is so powerful. And through this video, I want to introduce some of the content to our audience and, of course, our members from Taiwan. Maybe just to start off, if you don't mind, maybe you can tell us a little bit about you, how you kind of started this journey, kind of like of course, from the book, a bit of kind of scholarship and practitioner, both personal journey and the kind of scholarship investigation, both kind of started. But maybe tell us a little bit about you.
Well, that's an interesting question because I believe I've been blessed with an interesting life because I lived in many places. And I think each of them influenced me and influenced my journey, spiritual journey, and my scholarship. So currently I live in Australia, but it's, one of many stopovers in my life. But I was actually born in Poland many years ago. And it was now in hindsight, it was a very interesting place to be born because Poland was both Catholic and communist. So that means that I was exposed, on the one hand, I was exposed to the divine feminine, although in a limited form because of a Catholic background. And then I was also exposed to a communist state, which also taught me the importance of freedom in my personal life, right? So the importance of making choices and also the ability to read through any form of propaganda, so to speak. So it was also basically taught me my personal quest for freedom, right? So that was a very important lesson for me. But as far as the Catholic part was concerned, and I included in the first part of my book, The Other Goddess, which is a little bit of a personal journey through different divine feminine. I used to go to church as a young girl, and I was always saw these two images of the divine feminine in churches. One was that of Virgin Mary, which is very similar to what I would say maybe Kuan Yin. I hope I don't mispronounce it, which is, very kind of beautiful divine feminine, but almost like unachievable, like disembodied feminine. That's my interpretation. I don't want to insult anybody. And then on the other side of the church, I saw this image of Mary Magdalene, which is basically the main heroine of my book. And Mary Magdalene was kind of in the shadows, so to speak. She was somehow important, but there was something about her that was shameful. That was rejected. And in fact, for a long time, erroneously, because it's not true, she was portrayed as a prostitute, almost just to discredit her completely, right? It's somebody that is not important. So that was kind of a beginning, maybe not of my research, but of my interest in the divine feminine, and I was looking for examples of the feminine, which was both spiritual, but also erotic, because I wanted to embrace these two sides, and I never really believed that the Eros and spirit are separate. So because I didn't have any other examples, and I had only this polarity between Virgin Mary, which is this kind of motherly energy, and this other woman, this other goddess, which is somehow, pushed into the shadows. So I started to look into Greek goddesses because, this is what was available widely in Europe. And Greek mythology, and I was looking in, for example, Aphrodite, and I noticed, which is a goddess of love and beauty, and I noticed that she started up as a very powerful feminine, but then, like Mary Magdalene, she was pushed aside. She became kind of silly and not what originally was intended. So as we're coming closer to modern times, she was more and more ridiculed and was losing her power, just like Mary Magdalene. Then on my journeys, I started to be interested in Hinduism, and I looked at the goddesses there, and there, for example, we have goddess Radha, who is both spiritual and kind of an erotic, but she also embodies devotional love. And I was surprised that she was allowed to be portrayed this way, but then I realized that she was allowed to be like this only because she's very devotional and she's always submissive. So if there is a kind of full-on feminine example archetype or deity, even if she's allowed to connect Eros with the spirit, it is like in a submissive role. right? She's just always waiting for God Krishna to come, and she's just waiting for him patiently and prays to him and so on. And then I discovered that also in Hinduism there was another goddess, Sundari, which was a very powerful goddess. She fully embodied her spirit, her mind, her body, her sexuality. But then she was also pushed to the side again, like Mary Magdalene, right? So I thought that's very interesting that these goddesses that were once so powerful were pushed to the side or ridiculed, right? That the feminine could be seen only in this kind of pure, disembodied way, like Virgin Mary or Kuan Yin, very beautiful, but kind of not very achievable, right? Difficult to relate on some level. So that was the beginning of my journey. You probably know from, the first part of my book, when I went to Sweden, went to France, and, I wish to anyone to go to France when you're young, So because it's a beautiful experience of earthly delights. And then I went to Canada, where I studied my master's, bachelor's and master's at the Pontifical Institute and the Center for Medieval Studies, which is a very good, scholarship in my life. That was the best university and scholarship. And although I was there, I actually did not explore the divine feminine because it was not discussed. It was pushed to the shadows completely, and it was not discussed. And only when, through Malaysia, where I was an expatriate and a lecturer for Monash University in Malaysia, I ended up in Australia to do my PhD. After my PhD, two men approached me to go on a trip with them to Jerusalem because they did some archaeological discoveries and they wanted me to write about them. And there, I went to a church of Saint Mary Magdalene. And there I saw the portrait of Mary Magdalene that was very different to what I was used to. So she was standing there with her hand extended, with something in her hand, like an egg or a fruit. And she was a very powerful figure on this painting. She was not penitent, she was not in the shadows, it wasn't like a shameful feminine, because I noticed that in traditional religions, very often the feminine is either, like very, very virgin-like, or is kind of pushed to the shadows, ashamed. And she stood there in her, in her full power, with her hand extended, offering some wisdom to humanity. And upon my return to Australia, I started an academic research and spiritual research on that. And I realized that the same posture that Mary Magdalene had in the church, a feminine offering like spiritual wisdom to humanity, was represented in many other archetypes of goddesses in the West. So, for example, there was in Sumer, which is like 4,500 years ago, there was goddess Nimna, and goddess Inanna, and goddess Isis, which is an Egyptian goddess that, many people nowadays relate to. Then they had a very similar story to that of Mary Magdalene. So I realized that this archetype of a divine feminine, of fully empowered, wise feminine, who also claims her erotic powers, was actually always present there, but gradually pushed more and more to the side, right? So this, and then I'm not sure if I should continue or you have another question for me. Because once I start, I love this stuff, right? So once I start, and then I started to look closer into Mary Magdalene. Okay, so there were goddesses who were very similar to her. They were somehow associated, with magical powers, and also associated with the ascent to the spiritual realms, right? And they also always had a partner, So, for example, like it's been denied for a long time in Christianity, but Mary Magdalene, in some sources, was considered the partner of Jesus and his equal. So, for some people, it's super radical, right? So I started to look at alternative sources, but academic sources, and I have learned that, for example, there is something that is actually called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in documents that were discovered in the 19th century in Egypt, but only translated much later. And these documents are as old, like 2,000 years old, as other, documents that are for example, considered the Bible in Christianity. And then Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the main disciple, right? She actually teaches the male disciples, right? So she's like the goddess of wisdom, which in Egypt and it was called Sophia, the divine wisdom. And in 1945, another set of documents were discovered in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi, which in some of them, over 40 documents, and in some of them, like for example, the Gospel of Philip, she's actually called the partner, which is koinonos, which means a special or intimate partner of Jesus. So, now like the whole picture is emerging of this very powerful, wise, divine feminine that was present there all the time, and for some reason suppressed or repressed or even ridiculed, right? Called a prostitute, into the shadows. And just for historical facts, because I'm an academic as well, I realized that Mary Magdalene was not considered a prostitute until 6th century. Okay, so it's just a medieval edition, just to completely discredit her. Right, so this is basically like the history of my research to Mary Magdalene, and then I discovered that throughout centuries, all different esoteric groups were considered have a wisdom teacher and so on in Europe, which will also pushed to the fringes and often prosecuted because of this belief. So I'm not sure where you want me to elaborate on this.
Oh, well, that's perfect. Well, Dr. Kujawa is so rich as you're talking. I can feel your spirit and such a passion for it. It's describing, I'm getting the image of course, how the whole journey began with a split image of the feminine being only at the extremes. But with the scholarly research and the process, somehow the reality of the feminine, or represented through the different archetypes, become more enriched.
Absolutely.
There's so much
Absolutely. More. So it's not that, I want to discredit these beautiful other archetypes like Kuan Yin or, Virgin Mary in the West. It is that they are not full. They are not, So, and I think that they were kind of brought into life simply because of another polarity between the masculine and the feminine. So the masculine had to be like the breadwinner, and fighting in wars. So this polarity between the masculine and feminine was also present. And because the masculine had to be always the breadwinner and a warrior-like, they had to create a feminine archetype that was just basically very warm and welcoming and embracing the tired masculine, so to speak. But I think, and it is my personal opinion that I express in my book, it is that this kind of rigid division between masculine and feminine is very unhealthy. Because not every man wants to be a warrior and not every woman, wants to be a mother, for example, right? And it kind of splits our psyche in half. And actually, a very famous Swiss psychologist, Carl Jung, was talking about the fact that each woman and a man has masculine and feminine elements in them. And that the part of, becoming a fully human person is to balance the feminine and masculine within our psyche, within our body. And quite interestingly, this is what Mary Magdalene actually teaches in her gospel and in her writings and in the so-called Gnostic writings, which, the ones that were not accepted in mainstream religion in the West. She says that you have to become anthropos, which means fully human. But it's very difficult to ascend, or become fully spiritual unless you embrace all parts of your humanity, unless you balance the masculine and feminine within your psyche and within your body. And I think this topic is actually very important nowadays when there is so much discussion also around gender and so on, because I think people actually on a very personal level feel that this split is perhaps somewhat artificial for some of them, right? Not only between sexuality and spirituality, but also feminine and masculine, that this has to be balanced and embraced within our own being.
Exactly. I think what you said was so important, Dr. Kujawa, about really it's what is needed perhaps in the society now. With the split, with the war, with the people turn against one another, somehow there's an invitation to be more whole, to heal the split. and maybe heal them through the goddesses or through the wisdom of Mary Magdalene. So maybe with that said, would you mind telling us a little bit more about perhaps the importance then of the figure of either the goddess or Mary Magdalene in mending the split, or providing us with the wisdom? As you said, there was the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that provides ancient old wisdom that are still perhaps applicable to us today.
Yes, it is still, I absolutely believe that it's still applicable. And basically, in her teachings, she is saying this, that we have to balance, our own energies, and that we have to, and there's this beautiful question when somebody asks, what is sin? Right? And the answer is there is no sin. It's only, consequences of our actions that come from our lower self. Right? But if we make choices based on our higher self, when we are already completely whole, right, then there is no sin, because you appeal to the higher, so to speak, to the higher self. So also what is interesting in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is that she is the person who insists on equality, so to speak, because other disciples, and we have to take their times into considerations, right? Women had no part in this, but the other disciples argued, what is she doing here? Why is she even allowed here? Right? And she kind of has to fight for her position, and it is being told that she's imbued with the Spirit and she's allowed to teach. So it is also, I think, represents all of us who perhaps were somehow pushed to the side, and just to speak up for yourself, to speak up for your truth as well, right? And first speak up also feminine truth, which is, by the way, I want to say this feminine truth exists both in women and men, because on the level of consciousness, so to speak. And when we think about modern times, I think what happened is that we completely suppressed feminine, and not only in erotic terms, which is perhaps we can discuss later if you want to in this interview, but also in our consciousness. So basically, we are talking about left brain, right brain, and so on, right? And basically, we are always going in our civilization with a logical brain, with a mathematical brain that is strategizing, and it's a good brain, right? Like it gave us, a civilization the way it is, but now I believe it's taking us in the wrong direction, because we are going in the direction of artificial intelligence and, this environmental destruction and so on. And, wars, this is the intelligence that takes us to wars and suppression. When there is this other form of intelligence, which I call the feminine intelligence, that Mary Magdalene, represents as the also representation of Goddess Sophia, which is the divine wisdom, is that it is much more complex and intuitive, so to speak. So that's why Goddess is often represented as a spiral, because this is the path of the Goddess. You cannot deduct the ways of the Goddess. You, in a way, have to tune into your intuition, which is actually your higher mind. And in every esoteric and even mainstream spiritual traditions speak about higher mind, so whether it is Buddhi, or is it intellection, or in more modern terms intuition, it actually expresses the wisdom of a divine feminine, which is much more intuitive. You have to really, and much more subtle. So that's why, for example, a meditation gets us there, right? Because this voice of a divine feminine is very quiet in us, because we didn't nurture this. In fact, we suppressed it, right? And the voice of the ego is much louder.
Exactly. That's so important, really, the different intelligence and the intuitive wisdom that we all have, and has been what many traditions have been drawing from. Dr. Kujal, you mentioned about eroticism. I think that's a very important topic now, because that's another main split. I think modern age, how just like the split of how eroticism, or just like the male-female split, but perhaps even a bit stronger, how the Eros, it's such a powerful energy. Also, perhaps an intuitive wisdom and primal energy, but kind of chained and put into the dungeon and shadows, denied, yet people are drawn to it.
That's right. That's right. You put it actually wonderfully, Clark, because it is again, and that's why I'm using through the book the example of Mary Magdalene. She was pushed to the shadows, because she claimed her spirit, she claimed her wisdom, and she claimed her sexuality, as a partner of Jesus, whether people like it or not. And she was also an independent woman, so she was not just, attached to a male and, living this kind of a submissive life. But also she represents also the repressed Eros and the, I could say, vilified Eros. Because even look, and I really am sorry that people buy into this, because even if you watch modern YouTube, and I'm not denying that weird things are going on in the world, but everything that is pertaining to sexuality and Eros is very negative. It's always about talking about black magic and stuff like that. And, perhaps it's true, but there is a completely, Eros is just this beautiful, primal, very creative energy, and it can be used also for good. It can be used for a spiritual evolution, and you cannot repress it. Because what Carl Jung also said, the other psychologists that I mentioned before, you cannot argue a shadow out of existence. And, and both Mary Magdalene and Eros were pushed out of existence and vilified. So before I actually got interested in Mary Magdalene, I started to be interested in esoteric Hinduism and, in the tradition, classical Tantra, not what is practiced nowadays in the West, which is not, how it was intended to be practiced, but classical Hinduism and classical Tantra in early Hinduism, which was also suppressed in Hinduism, so this is not discussed in mainstream Hinduism. And I learned that, for example, there is actually a woman who was a founder of tantric tradition called Arda Triambaka, who was actually using female sexuality for the purpose of enlightenment. And also, a sexual erotic act between man and a woman in an appropriate state of mind and, and focusing on the spiritual evolution was used as this powerful propeller for the spiritual evolution, actually, right? And this tradition is very ancient and was not really written down until 10th century by an Indian philosopher Abhinavagupta in his work Tantra Loka, which is in his chapter 29, which I simplify in my book The Other Goddess, because his chapter is, encoded. It's almost impossible to understand what he was trying to say. When he discusses rituals, when, both women and men can use sexuality or eros for the spiritual enlightenment. When traditional religions always separated eros from spirit. And it is such an artificial thing, especially that, let me come back to the teachings of Mary Magdalene and even to Gnostic Jesus, from the same documents, when they say you have to be fully human before you can ascend. And to be fully human, you have to embrace all aspects of yourself. You cannot just push it like my sexuality is bad, and like you then pretend you live a pretended life, and some people, for example, are like that, like they're like pretending when they're all light and delight, but none of us is all light and delight, right? We have parts of ourselves that we have to uncover, but we have to bring them to light. We have to embrace them. Otherwise, we are not fully human, as Mary Magdalene is asking us to do. And in the another Gnostic document, which is Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene is actually considered a bride of Jesus, right? But they had an alchemical sexual union in which she was actually helped him to ascend as well. So these are the teachings that were repressed. And my question was in my book, what are they afraid of? Why repress it? And I think my answer to this is because it is beautiful and it is powerful.
Exactly.
It is very powerful. It has to, like every powerful tool, it has to be used wisely, right? But somehow I think it actually leads to a liberation, and that the constant suppression of such a primal force, beautiful primal force actually doesn't serve a spiritual evolution.
Exactly. What you say again is so important, Dr. Gajada. One is the wholeness, the wholeness, the pathway to ascension, at least from a lot of the tradition, we must come to a place of wholeness before we can really ascend or trail the path. If we are fragmented, how can we really kind of move forward as being a split person? And how the power of Eros is so strong. It is something, it's like a wave that we can ride to bring us to the next actual level or dimension.
Absolutely. And it's also a passion, so it's a beautiful metaphor that you said, it's like a wave, but it is, everything that nothing happens without the Eros. You're not going to do in school well unless you develop interest or a passion in something, love you love something and suddenly your interest is there, right? All great inventions were made because of this, like this desire to create something new, which is actually come from Eros, right? And human life comes from Eros as well. So I think it is a really devious, this kind of suppression of our Eros. And actually, even when you look at all films or Hollywood, and they perpetuate this kind of lowest level of Eros. So when I see, for example, most of the films, or not all of them, which, are kind of erotically, or I would say sexually free, because I actually make a distinction in my book between sexuality and Eros, because I think that sexuality was, misused, so to speak, in mass media and so on. It is such it's portrayed as such an animalistic and low force, right? Which is portrayed in a way as something that cannot grow and cannot be beautiful, right? And I think that this is wrong, Eros is a beautiful force, but before we can realize this beautiful force, we have to accept it in ourselves. We have to honor our own sexuality as well. Right? We have to honor our own sexuality and even have a quiet meditation. I honor my Eros, I honor my sexuality. I accept myself as I am. And all spiritual traditions talk about, self-acceptance. They don't talk really about suppression. They talk about self-acceptance, right? You cannot evolve if you're rejecting a part of yourself. And actually, history is full of saints who try to suppress their sexuality, and they couldn't, So I have examples of it. And as a scholar, I was studying early Christian saints, and they struggle with their sexuality. And you wonder, maybe you are not supposed to suppress it, right? Perhaps you were supposed to love it and use it for your spiritual evolution.
Exactly. It's a partner instead of like an enemy. Somehow it reminds me of the whole Greek mythology of Eros and Psyche, about the soul, the Eros and Psyche, and the spirit should be kind of in a way union and together in the path. And that lead me to the question of Dr. Kujal, because of course in Taiwan, I think we're at a very interesting cultural place where we have the traditional, very collectivist, even some even say that the traditional collective culture where there's the really inequality between so-called the man and woman, and there's a specific boxes that people should fit in, of course, being victims of patriarchy, for which are both so-called men and women are victims.
Absolutely.
Exposed to the Western kind of the new thoughts, and at that transitional period, and especially reclaiming, I would say there's a wave of kind of remembering or reclaiming so-called the Eros, the power of Eros. So maybe let's say if you have some words of wisdom or guidance for people, let's say, who are listening now, if you get inspired or feel a bit of either intuitive connection with Mary Magdalene or an awakening to the inner Eros, what your guidance or wisdom you can share?
So first of all, I didn't cover this, but there are spontaneous awakening all over the place, all over the world, probably primarily in the West, to the wisdom of Mary Magdalene, and to this goddess that fully reclaims her wisdom, sexuality, and her independence. So people really tune in, so to speak, to this archetype or to this divinity, which seem to be coming out, almost out of the ground, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or the Nag Hammadi 1945, these writings that were repressed and, like you couldn't, it's a bad, they're heretics, right, are coming to the surface. So I think the divine feminine is coming to the surface. And I also want to stress that, and it includes Taiwan, that patriarchy was bad for both women and men, because patriarchy was sending young men to war. Right, and women could be just childbearers, and have a submissive role, and this is, I think, we have to, and it is a collective responsibility wherever we are, to create new paradigms, to create new archetypes, to negotiate these roles. So, for example, at the beginning of my book, The Other Goddess, I'm talking also about, different relationship traps, So one of them is a romantic trap, because, everybody loves the romance, right? But, romance is not sustainable. It is not supposed to be sustainable. It has to evolve into something, right? So what happens to a romance, it is that we are not fully human. We are not fully authentic. We always want to be beautiful. We always want to be sexy. We always want to be adored, and it's simply not possible, right? We all have bad days, bad hair days, bad moods. So that's why romance is not sustainable, because we are just kind of showing each other, our best part. The other one is actually, and I hope I'm not insulting anyone, the marriage trap, because I'm not against marriage. I'm in a very happy relationship myself. But marriage trap is when people again come back to this kind of patriarchal thing, which means they assign roles to each other. Now you have to be a provider. So women are as guilty as men here, because now you have to work yourself to death to be a provider, and you have to be sexy and masculine and ravish me all the time. And you have to be a perfect mother, and you have to be always, attractive and always desirable. And this is, again, nobody's like that. And it ends growth. Personal growth. So I think we are in this beautiful, collectively, in this beautiful place right now, then we can look into the past also, what was good there, and create at the same time new archetypes. So we have to experiment. So I think it's actually very positive. Experiment. So for example, I have, even in my own relationship, I am the main breadwinner, right? And my husband is taking care more of the domestic stuff, because I don't have the time to do this. Lots of people are negotiating this kind of relationships, right? So what works, and also it's my personal belief, we should stay in a relationship as long as it also allows us growth. We should not just stay in a relationship for the sake of relationship, because then actually it's damaging also for children. It is my belief. So for everybody. So we have to redefine this relationship between masculine and feminine. What does it mean to be in a relationship? So it's a very kind of evolutionary time for all of us, I think, right? So, and it's a collective thing. And also what I have learned, while living in communist Poland, it is that, which is kind of similar to what I'm saying here, that we have to have a fully evolved individual for the collective to be happy. You cannot just, collectively say you have to do this to make you happy. That doesn't exist. We have to evolve as an individual. So actually, we have to explore who we are to actually fully contribute to the collective. Because it is not only about me, but unless I fully love and accept myself, unless I'm a fulfilled human being, unless I'm a balanced human being, and not just, taking orders from above or wherever, having no idea who I am, only then I can freely contribute to my collective. And I also believe that we should be free to choose the collective we want to be part of. So, and I think this is what the goddess actually teaches us, that explore other avenues of thinking. Don't just follow the traditional way of thinking, which is very rational way, that things are set in stone. For the goddess consciousness, nothing is set in stone. You have to redefine certain things. It is a constant evolutionary path for all of us. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it is a very complex question. And I think that actually we are collectively in this place, all of us. We have to reclaim this. We have to reclaim divine feminine, and whichever symbol of the divine feminine appeals to us. Magdalene is resurfacing as this powerful, feminine, erotic, and wise feminine, which it's, I think, very attractive for me personally, and lots of people are tuning in to this. But it also encourages us to redefine ourselves individually and as a society.
Exactly. Well, a lot of gems in what you just said, Dr.庫賈, about being creative, being playful, being curious, starting from oneself, because that's where we start, so we can contribute collectively. And at times, perhaps taking that creative risk as well, and then draw from the wisdom of the goddess that gives us those energy, can give us those direction, whatever the goddess mean from different tradition. And then, especially Mary Magdalene, and what you wrote in your book is a very good kind of portrait of how that looks like. You know,
and she was a little bit of a rebel as well, not in a, kind of teenage rebel, but, when she's constantly told, this is not your place, we want to put her back into the patriarchal system, right? And she just doesn't allow anybody to do this, She's just too smart, too wise, and too fully human, so to speak, in full acceptance of herself, to allow herself to be categorized, labeled, because very often we label other people, but we also label ourselves, So she stands there as this example for us, to learn from.
Exactly. A powerful, I would say, a catalyst, perhaps even of human evolution.
Absolutely, and a catalyst for human evolution, not only with respect to Eros, but also consciousness, right? Because our Eros is also part of our consciousness. So on a deeper philosophical level, Eros cannot be separate from spirituality, because both are part of our consciousness. And consciousness, or divine consciousness, chooses to express itself, herself, himself, in any way it chooses. Right? And Eros is also a very beautiful way of expressing itself, and can take us back again to the spirit. So it's this wonderful journey. And I personally experience this, so I know that it is possible when people, around the world have Kundalini awakening, have a awakening through Eros and through other means, which were previously just put into, to the shadows.
Of course. Wow, it feels like our conversation can go on and on. Just so many things that we can explore and talk about. But I know, of course, the time is precious. I know we're a bit arriving at the end of our time. But maybe just for a closure, Dr.庫賈, if you have, like, say, a final message, final invitation for the audience or whoever's watching this video. Of course, my trust is that my managers, they are drawn to your work, or drawn to this, even intuitively kind of pull towards listening to all this wisdom. What would be your final words, or kind of wisdom or blessing or invitation you want to say?
I would say, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of exploring, other parts that you've been suppressing, and you've been told that they are somehow wrong, and because actually, what you are trying to suppress, it's probably your way to your enlightenment. It's probably the way to your divinity. It's probably the way to your humanity. And if you don't mind, it is in English, but I'm going to read the last paragraph of my book, which is few sentences. And I think this is the last message. You are not alone on this journey of evolution. You are not alone. There is a higher consciousness within you, waiting to erupt with the ecstasy of your being. Don't be afraid. Make the turn. Make the turn now. And I think that we all have to make this turn now, move away from our habitual behavior. And it can be something simple, like don't take the same way to your work, because it already restructures your mind, take a different way, and then encourages your mind to experiment in many other ways. And I think we are really on the brink of wonderful evolution, because we are meant, as I'm saying here, erupt with the ecstasy of your being. We are not supposed to be afraid. We are not supposed to be suppressed. We are supposed to express ourselves, and only then we can truly actually contribute to the wellness of everybody else.
Exactly. Beautiful. Beautifully said, Dr.庫賈. And once again, just thank you for your wisdom. Again, such a pleasure to have you. And so as now, it's a good place for us to come to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. My pleasure.